The battlefield was loud with gunfire echoing from every direction, explosions shaking the ground, soldiers running, shouting, taking cover. And in the middle of all that chaos stood Captain Arjun, calm but intense, giving orders without hesitation as his team moved exactly the way he commanded. Pushing forward, breaking enemy lines, getting closer to victory with every passing moment, while everything around him felt like it was finally coming to an end. In the middle of that chaos, his radio suddenly crackled to life, and a voice came through clearly saying that the war had been called off, and all units were ordered to return to camp immediately. For a brief second, everything slowed down for him, even though the battlefield around him was still loud and active. But without reacting, he quietly switched off the radio and said nothing to anyone, choosing to keep fighting as if nothing had changed. Inside his mind, the same thought kept repeating again and again, that they could not just end it like this when they were this close, after everything they had gone through, after all the losses, all the effort, all the survival. It did not make sense to stop now. So instead of following the order, he made a decision on his own that there would be one last operation, one final push before everything ended. Later, as the firing slowed down, he called one of his soldiers and asked about the remaining ammunition, and was told that they only had enough for 2 or 3 days at best. Hearing that, he simply nodded because he already knew that no supplies were coming anymore since the war had already been called off. But he chose not to share that truth with anyone. That night, he gathered his officers inside a broken camp, where a map was spread out in front of them, and told them clearly that they were going for one final strike. The officers looked at each other confused because they were already winning, and there was no reason to take such a risk now. They questioned him, asking why not just continue as they were? Why push for something dangerous at the end? But he remained firm and said that this would end on their terms. Suggestions started coming in, one by one, as someone suggested attacking at night, but he rejected it, saying darkness would affect both sides equally. Another suggested striking from the hilltop, but he dismissed it as too slow, since they did not have that much time. And then, one officer suggested digging a tunnel to reach under the enemy base and attack from inside. The room fell silent, because it was risky and uncertain. But after thinking for a moment, he said it was a bad plan, but still the best one they had, and decided to go ahead with it. The next morning, they began digging, shovels hitting the ground repeatedly, dirt being pushed back, the tunnel slowly taking shape as hours passed, and the space became tighter and harder to breathe in. Sweat mixing with mud on their faces, their bodies growing heavier with exhaustion, but no one stopping. One soldier asked how far they had to go, but the captain simply told them to keep digging without slowing down. On the other side, far away, but heading towards the same point, the enemy captain had also received the same message that the war had been called off. And just like Arjun, he chose to ignore it, making the same decision for one last push and starting the same plan of digging a tunnel from their side, both teams moving toward each other without knowing it. Back in the tunnel, the space had become deeper and more unstable. As the air felt heavier and every movement required more effort, suddenly, a dull sound echoed through the ground, and everyone stopped. Someone whispered, asking if others heard it. But after a moment of silence, the captain told them to continue, even though now everyone was more alert than before. Time passed as day turned into night again, and both teams were now closer than they realized. Their movements slower, their breathing heavier, their energy almost gone, but still pushing forward. And then again, A louder sound came from ahead, causing everyone to freeze as the captain raised his hand, signaling them to stop completely. With one final strike, the wall in front of them cracked and broke open, and suddenly both sides were face to face inside that narrow tunnel where there was barely any space to stand. Both teams covered in dirt and sweat, exhausted beyond limit, staring at each other in shock because no one expected this to happen like this or this soon. For a brief moment, no one moved as both sides tried to understand what was happening. But then, a single gunshot broke the silence, and instantly, everything turned into chaos as the sound echoed violently through the tunnel. Bullets firing blindly in the dark, hitting walls and bodies alike, while smoke quickly filled the space, making it harder to see and breathe. There was no distance to aim and no space to move properly as soldiers pushed into each other, slipping on loose dirt, crashing into the walls, grabbing whatever they could to fight. Rifles turning into blunt weapons, knives flashing in close combat, hands struggling for control, for balance, for survival in a space that was never meant for fighting. The tunnel turned into a trap, where moving forward meant stepping into more chaos, and moving back meant falling over those behind. Bodies collapsing and blocking the path, forcing everyone deeper into the fight as both teams mixed together completely with no clear sides left, only exhausted faces and desperate movements trying to last one more second. The captain tried to push ahead, but there was nowhere to go as everything around him became a blur of movement and noise. The gunshots slowly turning into closer sounds of heavy breathing, metal hitting stone, bodies hitting the ground, voices fading into the suffocating space as the tunnel absorbed everything and turned it into something far worse than a battlefield. Time lost meaning inside that darkness as every second felt longer, and every movement drained whatever strength was left until the chaos began to slow. Not because someone had won, but because there was nothing left to continue. The noise fading away into a heavy silence that filled the entire tunnel. Above the ground, the war had already ended, and everything was supposed to be over. But below the ground, inside that narrow tunnel, far away from orders and commands, it turned into something else entirely. Something inescapable, where two sides came searching for one last enemy and ended up trapped in a place that became actual hell on earth.